So, if animals then can abstract, in groups in that way without language, presumably chimpanzees don't have, inner dialogue. Or, not even a
Well, I
chimpanzee,
mean,
an
there are
eagle
these
or, a
there are these weird
possum.
reports, right? So I mean, horrific circumstances. There was one in ancient Egypt that I know of, and there was one more recently, like 1970s, I want to say,
Uh-huh.
where like horrific abuse of children. Like literally, there was a child. That 1970 was a pretty horrific story. This girl was basically kept chained in a cupboard from the time she was born, basically, right until whatever age, 8 or 13 or whatever she was, and was fed but not interacted with at all, and had no language, right, and really was not able to ever master grammar. She did come to master, and she, I don't know the details of the case as to what she had words or whatever, but she never did master language the way we do, and it's kind of the way we take for granted.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting idea that there is a window for children
Right.
of acquiring these abstractions, the abstraction of sound naming, right? And it's difficult to put yourself in the mind of someone who maybe has the ability to differentiate objects and use tools or recognize a banana, and yet has no name for it, right? And has not made the abstraction to the idea of language or communication, right? It's really difficult to put your mind there. I've struggled with I've always imagined trying to put my head into I mean, Helen Keller actually also talks about this a little bit before she met her teacher, Sullivan. She had a very animalistic way of being in the world, deaf, dumb, and blind. She interacted with the world purely animalistically. If you read the reports from what she was like, and one of the biggest moments of change, and she reports this because she had memory of the moment she understood language, right? Which is a really weird thing to think about, right?
Sure, yeah.
But when the water was the word that got it, she put water flowing on her hand and then signed water into the other hand. And she'd been doing that for a long time, but she was just incredibly patient, and it finally broke through that this symbolized water in some like
Right,
that abstraction happened, and she
Yeah.
had memory of it happening, and she literally started running around touching stuff and saying,
What is it?
What's the symbol?
Right,
Because all of a sudden there's a new world.
Yeah.
Like I find it very emotional actually to think about. Like you have to think about it from that child's perspective. Like,
Yeah.
holy shit! Now I can communicate. Now, wait a minute. There's this whole symbology of representation that allows me now to. If I remember right, she called it the moment she became human in some sense.
Wow.
Right. Because that's actually more than any other. That's our survival mechanism.
Yeah.
Is language.
Language. Yeah.
Right. Because now I don't have to go
Not
try to figure
survival
out.
mechanism. That's literally the thing that distinguishes us from
Sure.
pretty much any other animal, right?
Right.
Language. I mean, no other animal has that.
That we know of. Yeah, I mean, and it's always questionable, right? And Orson Scott Card talks about this in his book. So he, Speaker for the Dead, he talks. It's a sci-fi book, so it talks about aliens and this and that. But humanity is spread through the galaxy to other planets, and one of his characters proposes what he calls orders of foreignness, right? And so let me see if I can not butcher this. There is the Utlaning, the stranger you recognize as human but of another country. The Fromling, which is a stranger you recognize as human but of another planet. And then there's the Ramen, which not the noodle, but Ramen is the stranger you recognize as human but of another species. And then there's the Varels, which is the stranger you cannot recognize as human because you cannot communicate. And the statement he makes briefly there is that if you can't communicate, you can never be completely sure the other guy's not trying to kill you. Right? And so there's this weird issue that comes up with failure of language, right? And especially if you're talking about another species or whatever, maybe they communicate through some other mechanism and we don't, maybe they have a language, but it's electromagnetic or it's not auditory, or maybe they have a language, but it's gestural, right? Who knows? There's these weird possibilities of, or slow. What if it's auditory, but it's subsonic and words are spoken over the course of hours, right? Well, that, I mean, like, there's all these possibilities that language could be going on, and yet whatever that animal is has to be treated as an animal and not as a fellow human because we cannot communicate. Yeah. And so we're forever locked into some sort of like battle because cooperativity requires language, right? If we're going to share resources and we're going to come to some agreement about how we're going to do that, right?
So, taking this a little bit further, plants do communicate with other plants under the soil, right? So you saw that fantastic fungi documentary.
Yeah,
as well.
Okay. So, we're talking about language communication.
Right,
so
right. So I was going to say, let's just
sure.
stick with the word communication for now.
Sure.
So say plants communicate with other plants through whatever sort of chemicals they release through their roots. So that's one level of communication. And then, of course, you have humans that communicate with actual language. And then, the argument is communication a spectrum, and at what level, coming back to the original conversation, what level do we call it language, right? Because, gorillas have been, trained to use sign language, right? So there's some capacity for language there, right?
Yep.
And dolphins too make noises, and they presumably understand each other just fine. They can coordinate, in hunting packs. So there's definitely some intelligible language there. But then what about ants? Right. And at what level? I guess maybe this, let's call it communication. It's not really language; it's communication. At what level do you decide
it's that language.
Okay, this is now, this is up to our level, right? And that raises another question. Say that we encountered.
Sorry, just to respond, it's kind of interesting. Is that the point he makes in the book? One of the most moving points in the entire book is he says, when we declare an alien to be Raman and not Varels, it doesn't mean that they've reached a threshold of moral maturity. It means we have. Yeah.
No, so if we were to encounter advanced alien life, right? I mean, the distinction of what is human and not human. I'm talking about human here in a general sense, right? Of what is worthy of our time and effort and to engage with culturally, right? Yeah, Raman. Say. Yeah. If that is just based on, if we think of language as a spectrum, right? If we say, well, trees communicate and, chimpanzees communicate, we communicate the best. And so therefore we are most human, right? So if that kind of a spectrum is also adopted by aliens, there's a very real chance. I mean, this trope of aliens not, seeing humans as worthy of anything at all is an old one. But, those aliens are usually just, malfeasant. They're just, they just want our resources, which is the dumbest idea. Like, aliens came all the way over there, and the only planet they could find resources on was this one. Right. They had to destroy all civilization to get the iron ore or whatever rare earth metal. Oh, they're here for the uranium. So I mean, that kind of paradigm could play out as well as this world is our for. I mean, who knows if they would even define life in any kind of meaningful way, right? I mean, would they distinguish between rocks and a colony of ants versus humans? So that's sort of something to think about it, because we do the same thing with chickens or ants or mosquitoes or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott Card's point to some degree, as I understand it anyway, I shouldn't speak for him, but as I understand his point, was a little bit that we think of it usually in terms of superiority and inferiority. But in fact, a better way to think about it is just compatibility. Are we able to talk enough to reach cooperativity? Right? And that's a weird metric, right? And actually, so the other hinging point of the story actually was that these aliens who were primitive and saw the humans in spaceships and all this stuff, and they were kind of in this hunter-gatherer type stage, right? They actually had access to a technology that we didn't have, but to them, they described it in religious terms, and they described it somewhat trivially because it was just a part of their life cycle, right? And so part of the story is that nobody realizes that they actually have something to offer that humanity doesn't have, right? Because they are considered inferior, right? And so the main character actually says is like, yeah, there's no chance you would notice that they had something to teach you, right? Because you've already set up the dynamic that way.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, you might think about that in terms of animals or in terms of like whatever you want, however you want to try and push that analogy, right? It really is just a matter of like, and pets is a great example, right? Is pets are sort of right on that edge where it's like, yeah, if you make a little bit of effort to read body language differently and read barking and read this and that, you can sort of get to a cooperative place, right? And if you can get to a cooperative place, then all of a sudden they're human they're a different human, but there's a much greater degree of humanization there because you've learned to figure out their language, even if it's just body language, right? That communication now has reached a point where cooperativity is now achieved, whether it's they're protecting you or they feel affection for you, or they are, providing emotional support when you're sad, or you are responding to them and they're responding to you, and you've reached some level of cooperativity where you're not just competing for resources.
Yeah, that is an interesting metric, right? Say, for example, we started exploring an alien planet. We land and it's full of puppies, right? And the puppies, to some extent can come in. It's just a nonsense example, right? But the puppies can show affection and excited when we land, and they don't have anything to offer us except that love, and then we would feel profoundly moved to protect the civilization, First directive, be damned. That's right.
There's a Star Trek episode.
That's right. Picard risks, being expelled from the Starfleet because he found a planet full of puppies. It's like, God damn it, they need to be loved.